Hello there, and welcome to another whiskey comparison video. Drew Hanish, and I am continuing my journey across Tennessee and tasting some Tennessee whiskeys. Tennessee's been a great mystery to me, and I wanted to learn more about what they're producing in Tennessee and get more familiar with the particular brands. Some I've seen, some I've heard about but don't know a whole lot about. And so getting a little history and also getting a little tasting in as well. So I came back from Tennessee with a variety of bottles, probably more than I should have bought. But I really did find that there were some of these really worth a deeper investigation. And during my tour, with all the COVID stuff going on, my tastings were more in these little small cups where you couldn't really get your nose in it. So it was a challenge to try to figure out which ones I wanted to buy and bring home. But I think I did pretty well. And these two whiskeys, very similar in many ways, but also some very big differences. And I'm going to go through that with you on both of these. But I was very happy with both of them. And the first one I'm going to sample is going to be the Nelson's Green Brier Tennessee Handmade Sour Mash Whiskey. And this whiskey has a long lineage. This is not a brand new MGP style whiskey. This is a whiskey whose recipe goes back over 100 years. In fact, interestingly enough, as Prohibition hit, George Dickel and Nelson's Greenbrier were actually the biggest distilleries in Tennessee, and Jack Daniels was coming in third. So there is definitely a history here. What's interesting about this particular whiskey is that it is a wheated Tennessee whiskey, whereas rye is used in both George Dickel and Jack Daniels. It does go through the Lincoln County process, and if you don't know what the Lincoln County process is, it's basically they filter through the whiskey through sugar maple charcoal before it enters the barrel. So this is the other whiskey that I'm going to try, and this one is made by Big Machine Distilling, also Tennessee South Distilling, and it is Clayton James. Now, when you look at this label, what's the first thing that you think? This has been named after a cowboy, right? Or some 19th century legendary figure. No. Actually, it was named after the distillers, or the people who started the distillery. One was a radiologist and the other was an engineer, and they just took parts of their names, put them together, and boom, they came out with Clayton James. It actually, as Clayton Cutler, the chief distiller, told me, he said it actually almost ended up being James Clayton, but it sounded a little too much like a lawyer. So there's no history really behind this Clayton James product, other than it's a whiskey where they are also playing a bit with the Tennessee whiskey formula. I don't know if you can necessarily call it the Lincoln County process, because they didn't filter this through charcoal, but charcoal, the sugar maple charcoal, was in play. They actually infused it in, and so it's a slightly different process. And so we're going to see what that does to the flavors. Now, in terms of age and proof, this one is basically 91 proof, and this is 90 proof. So very close on both of those. In terms of age, this is 2 years plus, and this one is 3.5 years. This is 44 months. It actually, if you look at the back of the bottle, it will tell you how many months old that is. So that's pretty cool. This is a small batch whiskey, and so my assumption is that they are not mixing more than a barrel or two to come up with that small batch to keep it around that 44 months, or it was a series of barrels that all came out and were distilled at the same time. So both are wheated whiskeys. So wheat instead of rye. So think of Maker's Mark. That's usually the standard we talk about, or an E.H. Taylor or somebody like that. And so very interesting to see that they are bucking the trends in terms of using wheat instead of rye in these whiskeys. Now, again, you may not be familiar with this name, and this is only available in Tennessee, the Nelson's Green Brier. But it is, you've probably heard of Belle Meade, and Belle Meade is also made by the same distillery, and word is that this is going to become much more widely available. Right now it's in central and eastern Tennessee as far as I know, but definitely one to keep your eye out for. So it's really a tale of two noses, because yesterday I was sniffing these two whiskeys, and this one just jumped right out at me, and that one seemed meek and mild. And today, this one is feeling meek and mild, and that one jumped right out at me when I stuck my nose in it. But this one is very complex, and it has there's not a lot of things that you would consider to be sweet in this. It has on the nose, it has, I get like leather, and I get tea, and I get a little coffee actually in there. There's a little bit of mint that comes through on the nose. This is one that's fun to just keep drawing on for a while, because you keep pulling out different smells out of it. I get coffee out of it. There's really nothing in that nose. Yeah, there's that almost a foresty kind of smell in there that I get every once in a while. I like to say it's probably the oak, maybe hints of that. Lots of interesting stuff going on in that one though. And that tea, it's like a black tea in there. So very, very interesting nose on this one. It's got a very nice mouthfeel to it. So what stands out to me on this is that toffee, it's almost like a Werther's original candy in your mouth, flavor wise. The heavy liquid, I think, also kind of adds to that. But I found out a secret yesterday when I was tasting this. If you drink a big mouthful of this, it actually kind of overwhelms you, and it's hard to pick things out. If you sip this and take this in smaller amounts, that toffee and caramel really, really jumps out. There's also some smokiness to it. The thing that I have to say about this, when it finishes, it starts going in these interesting like cherry flavors. There's a little bit of the grain, the wheat that I think comes out, and then the char of the barrel adds a little bit of smoke to the finish. I think of any American whiskey I've had, I don't know that I've named as many flavors from start to finish, and it actually sort of disconnects in a way. They're not all similar. Everything, there's no common theme through this, but they're all interesting, and it's a very pleasant. I try not to use the word smooth. It's very easy drinking. There's no spice in this. The wheat is doing its job in making a very mellow experience through the whole thing, but it still is. It's not boring. It begs you to pay attention to it and figure out what all those different flavors are that are coming through in it. So I was very happy with that purchase, actually, because I think when I initially bought it and I tasted it in a little cup, I was like, yeah, all right. I mean, it's whiskey. It's fine. It's not offensive. I seem to be all right with it. But getting your nose in there and really kind of picking up some of that earthy, almost piney kind of effect that I get out of it, and then that tea and the rest. It's just a really, really interesting whiskey. So the other is Clayton James, and we're going to take a nose of that. This one is hard to determine on the nose. Maybe I get a little of the caramel, the vanilla, and some nuttiness to it. I almost get like a peanut butter out of this one. What's interesting is, in some ways, I taste a little more of the youthfulness in this, even though it's older. It's an older whiskey. Um, there's some maple in there. There's some oak in there. I almost pick up like a soy sauce in there. It's really interesting. This is a bit more. It's less complex, or maybe it's complex, and I'm just not finding some of the flavors that are in there. On the finish, you start getting more of the apple and the toffee. There's a little bit more smoke and a little bit more bite on the end of this. I think the oak barrel actually has more of an effect on this whiskey. There is maple in there, but it's not sweet. This is not an overly sweet whiskey. I expect it to be, and then it ends up not being. It's very pleasant, though. It's got a nice mouthfeel to it. Yeah, there's some fruit in there, but it's almost like a cherry or something like that. There's some of the more spicy aromatics in there too, but they're very muted. So it's kind of hard to pull it out. There's a little coffee maybe in that also. It's really, really interesting. So I think if I had paired Clayton James up with just about any other whiskey that I've had in Tennessee, I would probably lean towards it because I think it is a very competent whiskey. But there's something special in this bottle for me, and I think it's that complexity in the Nelson's Green Brier that just begs me to keep sipping this. And so you guys voted 53% for Clayton James, 47% for Nelson's Green Brier. I'm going to lean in this direction. It's not a wide gap. Each has its own unique flavors and characteristics, and I'm glad I own both bottles. But if you said you can only buy one, I would probably buy this one because for me it leads to more investigation. And one thing I did play with Clayton James yesterday, because when I tasted it yesterday, I wasn't really pulling much out of it. It was just like grain, and I couldn't really get beyond that. So I actually added a little bit of blackberry essence to it that I had gotten shipped to me from Carson Valley, Nevada. And it took the flavors really well, actually. You heard me on a previous episode talk about Basil Hayden's Dark Rye and how it was too sickly sweet kind of a thing. And what's interesting is it put that little blackberry essence in there and sweetened up that Clayton James a bit. But it was so much better than that Basil Hayden Dark Rye was. Just a little drop of it. It didn't take a whole lot. So it's probably great for a cocktail, and it has some interest on its own as well. So I'd love to hear your comments on the video. Feel free to post them on YouTube, on Facebook, wherever you're watching this. And we'll do another tasting down the road. Cheers.